everyone. We're going to talk today about Chapter 7 in the Akers textbook, Labeling and Reintegrated Shaming Theory. So these theories focus on informal and formal applications of deviant labels and how those deviant labels stigmatize people. Here we can see these as both these labels as both an independent or a dependent variable. It's a dependent variable when we're trying to explain why certain behavior is defined as wrong and certain people are labeled as deviant. And it's an independent variable when we're saying that the label is leading to some other variable. Okay, so that it's an independent variable when we're saying that the stigmatizing label, the label is deviant of criminal, causes their behavior to continue and may even cause that behavior to escalate. So if you recall from deviance and social control, social groups create deviance by making rules, applying those rules, and then labeling those who break the rules as outsiders. So recall that we talked before about in deviance, about how the deviant is one to whom that label has successfully been applied. So deviant behavior is behavior that has been labeled as deviant. So the authors here are saying that the actual behavior is of secondary importance. So the important question here is who applies the label and who do they apply it to, and what determines when that label will be assigned. Agents of control, who function on behalf of those with power, apply labels and determine the way in which they're applied. So designation of a deviant label isn't always determined directly by violating the law. Remember, deviance, crime is considered deviant behavior, but deviance is a broader category. Deviance is behavior that somehow violates societal norms. People who are in less powerful groups, right, people who have less power, sometimes this is discussed in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of gender. Those are the people who are more likely to be officially labeled as bad and then punished. So the label results more from who they are than from what they actually do. And if you can try to think about some high-profile crimes, cases where we either know an offender broke the law and was not held accountable, or was somehow able to escape that deviant label, or cases where we know somebody was successfully labeled deviant. If you try to think about some of those examples, you can see how not everyone who breaks the law is labeled deviant, and not everybody who's labeled deviant is someone who's actually broken the law. So basically, this is a theory that explains how the fact that these labels are applied differently, and that is the result of how much power someone has. So the law and the criminal justice system represent the interests of the middle and upper classes. So the likelihood that you'll be arrested, convicted, and imprisoned is determined by your age, race, sex, social class, etc. This is very similar to conflict theory, which is discussed in Chapter 9. And if you think about some of the things you've learned so far about the system, when you think about racial or gender breakdowns of those who are imprisoned, you can start to see some of this theory. So labeling is a process, and if you recall from intro sociology, you talked about several different paradigms, and one is the symbolic social interaction paradigm. So labeling theory derives from that symbolic interaction perspective, and it's basically a perspective that says our identity, how we see ourselves, exists in context with society, acting, reacting, and changing as a result of social interactions with other people. So it's really looking at meaning and how that's communicated through language, speech, gestures, and the interplay of those things. So this is a perspective that's really looking at the symbolic dimension. What's the meaning of words and actions rather than actual concrete behavioral aspects? One major concept here is the looking glass self. So think for a minute about how you would describe yourself, or how other people would describe you. Our self-concept is often a reflection of how other people could perceive us. We are or we become what other people think we are. So this could set into motion a self-fulfilling prophecy. Think about a woman who's in a battering relationship, or a man who's in a battering relationship, where they're the person who's being victimized. if they're constantly told by their significant other that they're worthless, that nobody else will want them, they'll eventually believe that to be true. And they may come to this may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. What others think we are is communicated partially by applying labels, so we become shaped by those societal labels. So I want you guys to think about positive labels that might apply to you. Are you a smart person? Are you considered a leader? Are you considered a star on the soccer field? Okay. The way other people talk about us or see us starts to become sort of how we see our identity as well. And this can also apply to criminal and deviant behavior. This isn't always negative. Of course, we're going to mostly be talking about it in terms of negative concepts because we're discussing criminal behavior. So think about this. If you've been labeled as a criminal or an addict or a dope fiend or a crazy person, right? Think of some of the labels you might hear people use to describe people they know. That is what distinguishes labeling theory. Okay? Labeling theory is looking at both labels as independent variables. Okay? Those are things that exist, and remember, an independent variable should cause a change in the dependent variable. So by being labeled a criminal, a dope fiend, a crazy person, does that impact your behavior later on? Other theories may recognize unintended consequences, but labeling theory has this as its central notion. When we label somebody, what impact does that have on their future behavior? Do people internalize that label and then begin to behave that way? So let's look at the label as an independent variable in crime and deviance. So remember, dependent variables depend on some other variables, what that variable looks like. So criminal behavior, right? If that's our dependent variable. The independent variable we're talking about here is is the label. Okay, so how does the label impact our criminal behavior? So people who are labeled as deviant are likely to take on a deviant self-identity. This in turn makes them more likely to become deviant. The label, however, gets attached to someone as a means of reacting to and trying to deter deviant behavior, right? So one of the reasons we label people, as offenders is we sort of hope, right, that the punishment will deter any future deviant behavior. But the irony here, according to labeling theory, is that the person then becomes the very thing that the sanction was trying to prevent. So I label, you get caught selling drugs, you're arrested, you're convicted, you're labeled as an offender. The idea of the punishment should be to prevent you from doing it again. However, does that process actually create the very behavior it's trying to prevent? Labeling theory see this as an interactive process. Our self-concept is formed and reformed as we interact with other people. Individuals are self-reflexive, role-playing, and negotiating their identity. We try to manage how other people view us, and we react to what other people communicate to us. So sometimes labeling theory is sort of misunderstood as this simplistic one-way process. You get labeled, and then you engage in deviant behavior, but your self-identity is constantly being shaped and reshaped as a result of your interactions with other people. The labeling theory is predicting that the identity a person takes on will be profoundly shaped by the way in which others identify that person and react to him or her. Labeling theory argues that a person's subsequent deviant behavior is directly and significantly affected by the labeling experience. And this is especially true when it's done by a formal agent of social control. Okay? So we're labeled all the time by our friends, by our teachers, by our coaches, by people that, our colleagues, our bosses, okay? And that's informal. Those are informal agents of social control. And those can certainly impact us as well. But it's most likely to result in bad behavior when it's done by the criminal justice system. We have very little power to resist or negotiate those labels. Think about the impact that being a convicted felon has on somebody. Becker, who's a labeling theorist, went to great lengths to make the point that the outcome is the result of a process that could lead in other directions. So sometimes punishment does deter crime, right? Sometimes people do learn from their punishment, they are rehabilitated. But the core position of labeling theory is that social sanctions increase the chance of deviance. So being disgraced that way places you at high risk of behaving according to the label, right? So that means them playing the role of the deviant and developing deviant self-identity. Prior to this public labeling, which is the piece that's really important about formal agents of social control, deviance is unorganized, inconsistent, and infrequent. So the label is an event that leads people towards more stable and frequent patterns of offending. Okay? So the label leads to what's called secondary deviance. Okay? So some deviance exists beforehand, but the label leads to secondary deviance. That's deviance that results when the person who has been labeled as deviant engages in additional deviance, which they would not have otherwise engaged in were it not for the label. This happens when we ban whole categories of behavior, right? Prostitution, drugs, gambling. Legally prohibiting them sets up conditions that allow a black market to develop to meet this demand. So because prostitution, drugs, or gambling is illegal, doesn't mean those things don't exist, right? If there's a market for something, even if it's been made illegal, black market will develop to provide that service or that commodity. So what evidence is there of labeling theory? Well, labeling theory is a great theory. And I think if you think about how people were labeled in high school and how that might impact their behavior, you can kind of see how this could be true. However, it's really hard to measure, and haven't found a ton of empirical support for that. So earliest critiques of the theory objected to the theory's disregard for the actual behavior, right? So there is actually deviant behavior that's occurring before someone is formally labeled as a deviant. And also, we want to think about the fact that people don't always just readily accept a negative label, right? So some people do fight back, they reject, they deny that this label applies to them. And there are, of course, other factors that are influencing our behavior. Akers argued that past behavior is important. Yes, sometimes errors occur, right? Sometimes people are mislabeled, but the label doesn't occur in a vacuum, okay? People are labeled largely on the basis of overt acts. And especially when we think about the criminal justice system, right? When we think about how the criminal justice system formally labels somebody. So the biggest shortcoming of this theory is that there's not a lot of empirical support for it. So according to the theory, primary deviance that occurs before the label is applied, is pretty widespread. Okay, it's not very serious, it's sporadic, it's unstable. Only some people get caught and labeled. Those who do get caught, right, are likely to be labeled by the criminal justice system. So if you can avoid detection and labeling, then the deviant is not likely to develop a stable, serious career. But there's not a lot of research that supports this idea. The lack of empirical evidence doesn't mean that the labels and sanctions don't have these unintended consequences. It only means that it's infrequent. So the preponderance of the evidence, right, most of the evidence finds no or very weak evidence. That official sanctions alone have neither a strong deterrent nor labeling effect. So what are some implications of this, of labeling theory? If the problem is the label, right, the fact that someone has been formally labeled as a criminal and stigmatized, then what we want to address that label or how that label stigmatizes somebody. If you think about the juvenile justice system is really based around the whole idea that we don't want to stigmatize juvenile offenders. But in particular, juvenile diversion programs are supposed to do this. So labeling theory is very quickly adopted in the 60s and 70s, and we begin this process of avoiding official processing of offenders whenever possible. So diversion technically means to divert somebody from the system. Juvenile diversion happens in different ways. So Massachusetts has both a boys and a girls diversion program, and those programs, I worked in the program for boys. Those programs are actually someone has gone to court and been sentenced to them. So technically they're not really diversion, but they are called that. They also have a pretty low success rate. So one form is to remove juvenile offenders from jails, detention facilities, and juvenile institutions. And the program I worked in did do that. Okay, so juveniles were placed on a minimum of 90 days of house arrest. Okay, so they get electronic monitoring, the ankle bracelet. They have to go to this program 5 days a week. They go to school there. After school, 3 days a week, they have group counseling, and 2 days a week, they would engage in community service. So in they start deinstitutionalizing juvenile offenders. If you remember anything about juvenile offenders, right, you can become a juvenile offender one of two ways. So you can break a law that's actually a law for everybody, okay? You could stab somebody, you could steal something, or you could be a status offender, okay? So a status offender is someone who has broken the law, broken a law that is only a law based on their age or some other status they might hold, okay? So running away, drinking underage, skipping school, things like that, being a stubborn child. So, and that, as of 1974, kids are not supposed to be institutionalized. Juveniles charged with felonies cannot be held in an adult jail, right? They cannot be held for more than 6 hours. They have to be placed in a non-secure booking area, and then there's what's called a separation by sight and sound. Okay, so they can't see or hear adult offenders. We start sending kids to training schools less frequently. Training schools are like jail for kids, and they start decreasing the number of juveniles that are being detained. So from the labeling process, if we use diversion at the incarceration stage, like what I was talking about in my program, that might be too late. Okay. What you want to do is minimize penetration, which sounds dirty, but it's not. You want to minimize how far into the system the juvenile makes it. Pure diversion would get them out of the system ASAP and keep them that way unless they committed a new offense, but almost nobody does this. So diversion can occur at any point in the system. So as I mentioned, it's sort of like being placed on probation, and you would participate in similar programs as those who are placed in a facility. These do provide greater procedural justice. Status offenders have largely been placed into social services generally deals with them. So kids that are troubled and look like they're heading down a bad path but haven't technically, have only committed status offenses, they usually come under the purview of social services. But it hasn't made much of a difference in terms of reoffending. And one thing that happens that we see happen with intermediate sanctions in general, right, for adults or juveniles, is what they're supposed to do is take kids that would have been incarcerated and move them into community corrections type organizations. But what it also does is it takes some kids, we have a net widening effect. It takes some kids who in the past would have just gotten probation or gotten a slap on the wrist, and those kids end up being placed under more control of the system. So they're placed more rather than fewer use under system control. Kids are diverted to something but not from anything. So these are basically kids who under old policies would have been released, and now they're being sent to diversion. Okay, Braithwaite talks about reintegrative shaming. Some proponents of labeling theory have been so misstated that it's very difficult to assess them empirically. So Braithwaite suggests a less extreme, more complex model. Smith and Paternoster tested a deviance amplification model. And they said juveniles with higher risks of recidivism to begin with are the ones that are referred to as juvenile court and given the label. So if you think about, sort of the funnel of the criminal justice process, right? That it gets narrower and narrower the further into the system you go, from arrest to incarceration. The kids that are likely to be incarcerated are already people that are at high risk to begin with. Others have suggested a need to identify how labeling process itself takes place. Braithwaite has talked about, however, reintegrative shaming. And he tries to answer, when is a criminal label likely to produce a criminal self-concept in crime, and when is it likely to have the opposite effect? So how do we know when we're intervening that we're going to make the situation worse or make the situation better? So he talks about shaming. Right? Shaming is social disapproval. Right? If you think about when you were little, someone might have said, shame on you. Right? It's intended to invoke remorse in the person being shamed or to be condemned by others who are aware of the shaming. Right? So if you think about, like, if you had a teacher when you were a kid who made somebody, like, sit in the front of the room or, wrote their name on the board, right? We're trying to shame them with the idea that it will turn their behavior around. Braithwaite reserves the term stigmatizing for what he calls disintegrative shaming, right? So this is a shaming where there's no attempt afterwards to reconcile the offender with the community. And he says this is what provokes additional crime. Reintegrative shaming is followed by efforts to reintegrate the offender back into the community through words or ceremonies that decertify them as a deviant. If you think about our criminal justice system, there's a lot of ceremony around getting convicted or pleading out and going to prison and being sort of officially labeled. But we don't really have a process to unlabel that person afterwards, right? We sometimes talk about the idea that someone has paid their dues, but do we really practice that in society? Reintegrative shaming is predicted to produce lower crime rates. There haven't been a lot of studies on this. Studies of changes in compliance with regulations by nursing homes in Australia did find support. Studies on parental discipline, however, found little difference in delinquent behavior. So reintegrative shaming, how this relates to restorative justice and faith-based programs. So Braithwaite argued that reintegrative shaming supports policies that facilitate the development of communitarianism at the neighborhood, community, and national level. Basically, we want to find ways of shaming that are apt to create genuine remorse and then allow that offender to be reintegrated back into the community. And so we talked about this before. We definitely talked about this in criminal courts. We talked about restorative justice. Okay, and restorative justice, the earliest advocates, the earliest places took place were in Australia and New Zealand. Please note, however, not all restorative justice programs are based on reintegrative shaming. The relevant features to this theory include confronting the offender in a respectful way about the consequences of the crime, so shaming someone without degrading them, taking explicit efforts to avert stigmatization, and we want opportunities to counter accusations that the offender is bad with testimonials from loved ones, and an explicit commitment to ritual reintegration. We want to give them opportunities for repair, to restore relationships, to apologize, and to be forgiven. And we want those to be sincere. This includes things like community service, making direct apologies to victims, accepting responsibility for harm, making reparations. It also involves things like victim advocacy, mediation, peacemaker courts, restorative conferences. Right, so we talked before, I think we definitely talked in criminal courts, but we might have talked in some other courses as well about I think I told you guys that story about a woman whose car was stolen, and in the car were the only remaining pictures of, her deceased grandfather. And in that case, not that she doesn't want her car back, and not that that doesn't matter to her, but sometimes the harm caused by a crime goes beyond what seems pretty obvious to society. Maybe that's the victim that would want the opportunity to explain to that offender how that behavior has impacted them. So Vermont has a reparative probation program. Basically, somebody serves 90 days of reparative probation instead of jail or probation. They go before a community reparative board multiple times where victims and families are invited to provide information and attend those sessions, which are open to the public. It's non-adversarial, non-stigmatizing, and active participation is encouraged. So there's a lot of open-ended discussions here, and they try to decide on specific ways to make amends and learn to avoid reoffending. If you fail to meet the requirements of that program, then it's like probation in the sense that if you fail to do what you're supposed to do, then you're going to be incarcerated. You have to serve the original sentence. Also, faith-based prison and community programs. Prison Fellowship Ministries has an Interchange Freedom Initiative. These are church-based volunteers that serve as chaplains, they lead groups, they mentor. And after serving 16 to 24 months, they're released under parole supervision for 6 to 12 months. And in this situation, local churches provide aftercare and continue any previous interventions. Much of what is covered by restorative justice is things that have been in existence for a long time, okay, but it brings them under sort of a single rubric. It's really based in customary dispute resolution, conflict resolution, and it concentrates heavily on minor offenses and juvenile offenders. So Braithwaite says that reduction of recidivism, right, reducing how likely someone is to recidivate, not rehabilitation, is the goal of reintegrative shaming. But rehabilitation should also occur naturally. They want to modify attitudes, thinking, and behaviors of offenders to lower the chance of reoffending. Some proponents believe that many rehabilitation programs are not truly restorative in nature. Restorative justice also reflects other theories as well as political, religious, and moral philosophies. So restorative justice argues that it is right, morally right, to hold offenders responsible, but it's also morally right to help them restore their position in the community, while also protecting public safety. So they're trying to mobilize informal social control processes. It doesn't focus as much on deterrence, incapacitation, and formal efforts. They have a clear preference for informal, non-adversarial interventions. So we want to hold people accountable in a way that helps them make things right. Briefly, asserts limits on the use of punishment, but no limits on the use of mercy. Okay, so he does not accept retribution and just desserts as a legitimate goal. He also has rejected moral and cultural relativism, and he endorses respect for universal human rights, dignity, and good citizenship. He does not, however, reject the use of coercion and punishment. Without the threat of force, law violators would not have participated in any meaningful restorative process. So basically, if there's a threat of punishment there if they don't meaningfully participate in the program. He also proposes a pyramid of appropriate responses to those who violate the law. We move from the most respectful process, least costly, least coercive, to most coercive and costly. So what are some potential problems here? A lot of times restoration for victims is more symbolic than substantive. We could see net widening here as we do with any sort of intermediate sanction. There's not a lot of attention to due process and protection of legal rights when we're in an informal, non-adversarial proceeding. The more probation conditions we have, the greater the risk of failure. Confrontation with offenders in conferences may actually be harmful for victims. It may increase their fears of re-victimization. And maybe this is too utopian of an idea. The key question is, does restorative justice work? And as I've mentioned to you guys before, I haven't seen a lot of good programs in this regard. So it's pretty inconsistent, and there's not a lot of great evidence for this. Some do find lower recidivism rates, but they tend to concentrate on evaluating whether or not they're successful based on, are the participants satisfied? Do they feel like they were treated fairly? But even if these programs are run poorly, they're not likely to increase recidivism. Some research tells us that faith-based programs, so those who have the highest participation, are significantly less likely to be re-arrested in the first, second, and third years, but by the 8th year, there's no difference. So basically, we don't have sufficient research to make a decision about this. But as we know with all programs, even the best programs are only going to have a modest effect. So what's the past and future of labeling theory? At the center of labeling theory is the concept of the stigmatizing label, which is unique to this theory. It really resonated at the time that it was developed because it was developed during a period of a lot of political change and an academic climate in the 60s, and becomes less dominant by the 70s. If you were to talk to different faculty you might have, if you were in a bigger school with more criminal justice faculty, you will find that the people who are probably most interested in labeling theory were people who were studying criminology during that time period. What we need to focus more now on is informal labeling, right? And I think we'd be likely to see more significance here. So worry less about these formal agents of social control, but what about when people you actually care about label you? That's it for this chapter.